So we have a few questions here that I would like to address in a direct and casual manner, so to make it very relatable to all. Some of these questions have quite a lengthy backgrounds, others don't. So I will read that, just picking what feels necessary to relate in order for the response to make greater sense to those of you who may be not familiar with exactly what is being spoken about here, and to give a fuller picture. So the first question is on upayas and kundalini. And just to remind everyone that upayas is a Sanskrit term for means, spiritual means. There are 4 upayas in Kashmir Shaivism, and we have spoken about this in many of our courses, and I think we spoke about this at the beginning of this course on Kundalini. So last week's module left me in awe, as it surmised my feelings perfectly, specifically your description of Kundalini wanting to return to its original source after being coiled in its identification with the gross, earthy material aspects of the manifest world. And then the person shares the Kundalini experiences, which so far have been quite beautiful, and accompanied by kriyas, spontaneous chanting, shaking, and along this journey, also these brief spontaneous movements where the boundary between myself and everything else around disappeared, and I viscerally felt now, on a certain level, every little thing in the universe is me, and I'm actually pulsating as one with everything. So very beautiful experiences. I just confirmed that these are really sounding transparently, clearly, as authentic and very, very visceral in their sense. However, the sense of myself still arises with significant strength in my daily interactions and activities, and I feel awareness being constricted again to this small self, with plenty of pain and tension. So the question, or rather several questions: does the upaya naturally change and evolve along one's journey, abandoning anavupaya gradually when the doer is seen through? I feel less pulled towards actively doing anything to foster the integration of Kundalini, and more pulled towards returning to the source of the I, or continually reminding myself of the underlying oneness. Will this lead to the breath and Kundalini flowing through Sushumna, or are the more physical means still necessary? I feel a lot of physical tightness in the chest and throat, accompanied by the continuous twitching and more elaborate kriyas and chanting when I fully relax the areas, which suggests to me that there are still physical and energetic blockages preventing the proper ascent of Kundalini. Thank you so much for your teaching and wisdom. This course has resonated immeasurably, and I cannot thank you enough. Well, just to confirm that all this is very, very good and legit and natural, I would not begin to doubt the process itself, because at a glance from what has been shared here, it clearly has its own dynamics and it unfolds, but all that what comes here under questions is legitimate also in terms of these dilemmas, of that returning sense of constricted self, of that sense of maybe imposed individuality again. So let's begin with just tweaking it a little bit here. As you feel less pull towards actively doing anything to foster the integration of Kundalini, and more pull towards returning to the source of the I, or constantly reminding yourself of the underlying oneness, as you have put it. Yes, I would concur that this is indeed a good approach. The only thing is that this requires a tremendous discipline, because this kind of approach requires that vigilance. And if you are embedded with that vigilance, because not all of us have that to the same degree, then this will definitely bear the results, and this would be conducive to the further unfoldment. I may want to suggest you that certain more devotional or heart-based attitudes are also good to cultivate, simply because giving yourself to the process, you need to bear in mind that if the process is some kind of abstract, if not mechanical unfoldment, with all that maybe was what is added into this as understanding of the dynamics and so forth, has its limitations if it is not accompanied by that more feminine in its quality, perhaps. Feminine, not genderizing it at all here, because many men are those who simply have born into the male body, if we want to speak that way, have exhibited these very feminine qualities of surrender, acceptance, and giving oneself repeatedly to the power of that transformation, where the quality of the process is never separate, or rather the giving oneself to the process is never separate from the quality that Kundalini here culturally and traditionally exemplifies as that Shakti, as that feminine force, a motherly force which has different qualities to it as well. It can be quite unapologetic, quite forceful, quite dominating, overpowering, just as the quality of the motherhood in every respect, as well as nourishing, as well as caring, healing, where we feel that we can give ourselves to that motherly care fully. I'm just bringing that simply because I somehow sense that this may be something that will definitely be beneficial in terms of your both understanding and implementing it into your practices. And practices here, of course, as an attitude, a daily attitude. With regard to that, what you experiencing as feeling that this sense of I is constricting back to the small self, this needs to be clearly understood as well, so as not to fall for any maybe sugar-coated perspectives that somehow with the awakening and with the expansion of consciousness, and even with the experiences of this, what you have clearly outlined there in your background of feeling oneness with everything, feeling yourself in the universe, in the smallest aspects of it, and feeling that all that is part of you. Even when these experiences are there, undoubtedly, which is accompanied by tremendous sense of expansiveness and that all-embracing sense of self, all-encompassing, becomes a cognized reality rather than mental, intellectual concept. This does not mean that that pulsating quality of contraction and expansion is not going to be experienced by you or anyone else. This needs to be already clearly acknowledged and understood, and not necessarily dismissed, but simply sense into whether this contraction and expansion has elasticity to it. It has that molten quality to it. In other words, yes, sometimes we feel contracted, and in that contracted state, the experience is very acute, which, by the way, is required. In order to perform certain task, it has to be at the expense of everything else. Let's say watchmaster, by hand assisting in assembly of that magnificent mechanism of the watch, or someone involved in the task of performing something which requires this cutting out of all the other sensory and as well as mental perceptions, which is again at the expense of that being everywhere all at once. No, our awareness is as a focal point, laser point of attention to here and now, to this particular spot, dilemma, something, creative act, something to be solved. How can that be done if not at the expense of this expansiveness? So you need to understand that this is part and parcel and in the nature of consciousness itself. So that's how consciousness vibrates at the infinitesimal level and in terms of the grand event, if we are to speak of it in that manner. So in other words, it's not a limitation on your part not to be seen as some kind of return without harvesting the benefits of constantly being unraveled across the universe, but more with that understanding of the elasticity of that process. And the only thing is to observe is how long one remains in that contraction, how quickly that contraction is released. If this contraction is accompanied or provoked, let's say, you will use that, by a certain encounter, by a certain reaction, response, interaction, how does that manifest itself? How long do you remain in that? If there was, let's say, an argument with the environment, with someone, with something, there is this lack of letting it go in a given moment, simply because maybe it was required. It had to be that way. Maybe there was this disagreement, polarization of opinions. Again, in any given circumstances, you can just complete the dots yourself. How long do you remain when all that wanes down? See, all these stories of great beings who have realized their nature, realized their essence, if we pedestalize them and strip them of this, what we then speak of as human qualities, we're doing ourselves disservice, because we creating that unbridgeable gap between where I am and where these beings are, because we strip them from these humane human qualities. And we've done that quite a bit in our culture. It has its benefits to see someone as this walking God. And this is another story altogether. It has its quality, it has its benefits, and it to be worked with. Because if you can recognize divinity in someone with the body, who is breathing, living among us, then certainly that possibility is being then inadvertently recognized in yourself. But if this is being done in the form of stripping that individuality from all its human qualities and only the divine remains, then we create this often unbridgeable gap. So even these great beings, all of them have exhibited these sudden pangs of contraction. So you need to know this. There are even talks in Kashmir Shaivism of how unity consciousness proper is experienced. And there are slight interpretations. Not all sages here agreed squarely There are some variables, some subtleties involved. For some, this was complete and utter negation of that what rears and expresses itself as the living being individual, aka a contracted state of awareness. In other words, they lived as drowned in the sea of oneness. Allusions, of course, are plenty out there in spiritual literature, not just of Indian culture. You can find that in many, many other cultures, Occident and Orient including. So not in all the cases there was this quality of drowning in the beloved. And then if one is drowned in the beloved, one drowns the beloved with that. This is also need to be understood. So that state is incomprehensible, cannot be articulated or spoke about. But those who had to still function in the world one way or another, let alone raise families, interact, have jobs, have some occupations, work with others, share, their activity would always be at the expense of a release of that, what that complete and utter unity he represents. And the unity is then being measured by the degree of how one integrates this, what seems polarizing qualities of awareness as contraction versus expansion. Because if this world of interactions, forms and phenomena is being seen as a contraction, because then one is experiencing it through this aperture of sensory phenomena, organs of cognition, sense perception for the sake of sense perception, then that in itself is a kind of a deliberately localized picture. It's like this divine instrument through which some tangible experience can take place. Then how do we understand and how do we relate to that? If we are equipped with this understanding that this is nothing other than awareness itself, undergoing that experience for the sake of its own sport, then that brings these reflective qualities where that acceptance, recognition and understanding seeps through all these subtle pathways into the structure of this world, into our spiritual anatomy, down to the cellular level, where we then find our own self, even amidst that densest of all contractions. So that is the mark, perhaps, of true integration and completion of self-realization, because it's not just realized for, oh yeah, now I got it, yeah, I've made that real visceral recognition, but then it fades into memory and we are dealing with daily events. And these daily events present us with this living being, so and so. The character, the story kicks in again. So this is where you begin to work. This is where the reflection, healthy reflection, then this also is consciousness. This also is extraordinarily, paradoxically enough, is consciousness. This is my own self. But if it's not accompanied by repeated openings, repeated expansion, repeated sense of all-embraciveness, then of course, sooner or later, the egoic structure will reclaim itself. In other words, that obvious sense of that individual self may have gone through some fracture, but it has not been reabsorbed into that what we speak of here as quality of Shiva, into that awareness. So therefore it remains, maybe in the recesses, and this, in spiritual language, often spoken as that spiritual ego or spiritual sense of self, which one need to observe attentively. One needs to examine and test. because there will be plenty of tests. So going back to what you have shared and your dilemma, I would say with all that what has been said so far, that not to discard that feminine quality of surrender and acceptance, that working with that quality of that Ishta Devata, that quality of the divine here is not just a mechanical process, but you're giving yourself to your own consciousness, in this case, which has this feminine quality. She is Shakti, the great mother, the great divine, or the eternally forever virgin, as also often referred to in the tradition, in fact, paradoxically enough. So, and not to worry too much about this return of the constricted sense of self, because this is part and parcel. The integration will take care of it, as long as you remain vigilant and sincere, as long as you remain without being pulled into these attempts of reconfiguring the narrative. We all will do that. All of us will start to build a certain new narrative. This also is going to be spoken in the Kundalini care. But let us not rush into this creation of the new narrative. YouTube videos out there are plenty of these accounts of people going through some glimpses, and very quickly they want to claim it into the structure of that social persona, and narrative is being built there. An opportunity is wasted there and then. And you know why. I can see through what you have clearly displayed here that you understand exactly what I mean by that. So,